Eastern State Penitentiary, Pennsylvania, United States story. As known as being one of the most expensive building built in the United States at the time, the Eastern State Penitentiary became the portrait in design to 300 prisoners. The facility was operated under Pennsylvania state from 1829 to 1913. The system was used by Quakers, designed to force the incredulous sent there to look inside themselves to find God, and in reality the system which placed inmates to complete solidarity drove any sane man to madness. Tough time. Prisoners at the Eastern State had a toilet, table, bunk, Bible in their cell, in which they were locked all but 1 hour a day. When the prisoners did leave their cells, a blockhold would be placed over their heads so that you could not see any other prisoners as they were guided through the halls of the prison. Interaction and any form of communication between inmates was forbidden. Inmates lived their life in mundane solidarity and would only get a glimpse of sunlight known as the eye of God, which came through the slit in the prison cell. In desperate need of human interaction, prisoners would tap on pipes and whisper through the vents to each other. If caught, penalty was brutal. Harsh punishment. The water bath. The inmates who broke the rules risked being dunked in the bath of ice-cold water, then hung from a wall for the night. During the winter months, when the punishment was popular, the water on the inmate's skin would form into a layer of ice before morning. The mad chair. The mad chair was named such because it was not uncommon for inmates to go mad before his punishment ended. Inmates would be strapped into the chair with leather straps so tight that it was impossible for them to make the smallest movement. They would sit for days without food until the circulation in their body was almost stopped from the tightness of the straps and the lack of movement. Iron gang. The most deadly punishment known as the iron gang, and the specialized design for those inmates who refused to obtain the no common policies. An iron collar would clap onto the tongue of an inmate and then clamp to his wrist, which were strapped high behind their back. Any movement resulted in a tear of the tongue. Severe bleeding. Many inmates who suffered this torture died from most blood before the torment ended. The hole. Dug under block 14, the hole was nothing but a pit in the ground where incurable inmates would stay locked, sometimes for weeks. There was no light, little air, and those known into its torturous grip would receive water, a slice of bread if they got to it before the rats or roaches. It's been reported that the Quaker was responsible for the punishment to the inmates, were forced to endure the extreme penitence with something the hired staff in the prison designed and enforced. Charles Dickens visited the prison in 1814 and found conditions appalling. He described the inmates at the Eastern Pen as being buried alive, wrote about the physical torture inmates suffered at the hands of their captors. Prior to its reform in 1913, the prisons, which was designed to house 250 inmates, had over 1,700 prisoners jammed into tiny makeshift cells where there was little light and even less ventilation. Finding the conditions of the prison unacceptable, the prison was taken over and reformed, and the Pennsylvania state system was abolished. Finally, in 1971, the spawn monster of prison was closed. Ghost stories of East State Penitentiary. Since the closure, visitors, employees, and those researching paranormal activity have reportedly heard unexplained eerie sounds throughout the prison. The Locksmith. One major paranormal episode reported occurred to a locksmith during the restore block in cell 4. According to the tale, he was working to remove 140 years old lock from the cell door when a massive force overcame him, so powerful he was unable to move. Some believe when he removed the key, it opened a gateway to the horrific past, and often the spirits caught behind in its bars and a pathway out. The man spoke experienced an out-of-body state as he was drawn towards the negative energy which burst through the cells. An Augustus face appeared on the cell wall. Hundreds of deserted forms of spiral around the cell block. One demonic form seemed to beckon the locksmith to him. The man's experience was so vivid years after he would stood in fear when he talked about it. Today, the penitentiary is open to public. In a typical year, 2, maybe 3 dozen paranormal investigations take place in the cell blocks. According to Assistant Program Director Brett Bertolo, they almost always find evidence of activity. Tourist employers have reported hearing whimpers, giggling and whispers coming through from inside the cell walls. Waverly Hills Sanatorium. One of the most prominent haunted hospitals in the United States can be found in Louisiana, Kentucky. The Waverly Hills is believed to be one of the most manifest and many difficult types of ghosts. Spirits are many other paranormal manifestations. The place is also visitors to feel the history of the hospital, where many people were very sick, mistreated and died. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium was built in 1910 for treating people with tuberculosis, which was the most rampant during that time. It was eventually closed in 1961 because of the discovery of antibiotics which could cure tuberculosis, and led to the decline of patients being admitted to the hospital. From the time it opened up till it closed, there were around 64,000 patients who died because of the disease or through the unusual treatment methods being used in the facility. Beverly Hills Sanatorium was a tunnel more popularly known as the Body Cult. This tunnel was initially intended for moving of materials used in the building to the hospital. They estimated the very long trip up the hill where the hospital is located. The tunnel was eventually used as an alternative passageway for the dead bodies of patients from the hospital down the tunnel exit at the bottom of the hill. This was done so that others, patients and staff in the hospital would not see that someone died or some were numerous bodies being transported. This is why it was called the Body Cult. Queue of number of stories about Waverly Hills involving the Body Cult and the ghosts and shadows is haunted the tunnel, and the doctors who opened up the bodies of the dead patients and drained them. Other examples of the Waverly Hills stories involve ghosts and nurses who were working at the hospital, and one of the most famous of these concern rooms is 502. People claim to have seen ghosts of a nurse in a uniform in the room. Some say that the ghost tells them to get out of the room 502. It is said that the body of a nurse who had hung herself had discovered in the room. Many of the tales surrounding the room of 502 say that the nurse killed herself because she was pregnant and was not married, and that the body had been in the room for quite a while before it was discovered. There is also stories of other nurses who committed suicide by jumping off the top of the building after working in room 502. No one knows why she did this. Many stories about Waverly Hills have to do with the shadow doors closing on their own, and ghostly spirits that roam the 4th floor of the hospital. This area is considered as one of the most haunted places in the hospital. There are also stories about a 3rd floor of the building involving a little girl with a face that has no eyes. Besides this, there are many stories about a young boy who is said to be playing with a bouncy ball, and there are others Waverly Hills stories about ghosts, unexplainable events, experiences, and many people who have been there to the place. And this is why this is one of the most famous haunted locations in the United States, and why many other people want to visit this area to see these stories and are indeed true.